When the United States entered the Second World War, the reaction inside the German High Command was measured, not fearful. There was no sudden panic in Berlin, no frantic belief that the balance of the war had shifted overnight. To the men who had spent years perfecting blitzkrieg, who had shattered professional European armies with speed and precision, America was not yet a battlefield threat. It was an industrial one. German officers understood factories. They understood steel. They understood logistics. They knew that American shipyards could replace losses faster than Europe ever could. But war, as the Wehrmacht saw it, was not won by production alone. It was won by discipline, tradition, and experience under fire. And in those categories, they believed, American soldiers fell short. The German army had been shaped by decades of military thought. From the Prussian tradition to the hard lessons of the First World War, German doctrine emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and unity of action. Orders were followed precisely. Initiative existed, but it flowed within rigid structure. The battlefield, to German officers, was a place where cohesion mattered more than individuality. The Americans, by contrast, appeared unfamiliar with this mindset. Intelligence reports described American troops as informal and relaxed. Soldiers addressed officers casually. They joked. They lacked the outward severity of European armies. To German observers, this behavior was not a cultural difference, it was a weakness. In the Wehrmacht's worldview, discipline was visible. It was strict. It was unquestioned. The Americans did not look disciplined. Many German officers believed that American soldiers relied too heavily on machines. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, artillery, all impressive, but dependent on supply. Strip away that support, they believed, and the American soldier would falter. He would lack the endurance to continue. He would retreat when pressure became unbearable. This belief was reinforced by stereotypes that had existed long before the war. Americans were seen as wealthy, comfortable, accustomed to abundance. A nation of consumers, not survivors. Men raised far from hardship, entering a war that demanded sacrifice beyond imagination. To seasoned Wehrmacht veterans, who had marched across Europe and fought in brutal conditions, this mattered deeply. They had seen what prolonged stress did to soldiers. They had watched armies dissolve not from defeat, but from exhaustion. They believed American troops would break once the war stripped away comfort and certainty. What the German High Command failed to understand was that American military culture had grown in a different direction. It was not built on centuries of tradition. It was built on problem solving. On flexibility. On the idea that failure was not final, but instructive. American soldiers were trained not only to follow orders, but to improvise when those orders became impossible. Non-commissioned officers were given authority and responsibility. Sergeants were expected to lead independently if necessary. This decentralization was subtle, but it would become critical. At first, none of this was obvious. When American forces began arriving in large numbers, they looked inexperienced. Training was rushed. Units were assembled quickly. Many soldiers had never seen combat. German officers felt confident that once these men were tested, the illusion would fade. The Wehrmacht had defeated confident armies before. They had broken France, a nation that believed itself secure behind doctrine and fortifications. They had pushed deep into the Soviet Union against forces that outnumbered them massively. They believed they understood how wars unfolded when inexperienced troops met seasoned professionals. But the American soldier did not behave the way history suggested he should. German officers expected early collapse under pressure. They expected hesitation when plans failed. They expected fear to spread once losses mounted. Instead, they began to observe something that did not fit their assumptions. American units, even when poorly led or badly positioned, did not disintegrate. They made mistakes, yes, but they absorbed them. Soldiers learned rapidly under fire. Procedures changed quickly. Failures were analyzed rather than excused. This was deeply unfamiliar to the Wehrmacht. In the German system, doctrine evolved slowly. It was refined over years, not weeks. The idea that an army could adjust its methods in the middle of a campaign was unsettling. American soldiers were also motivated by something the Germans underestimated: confidence in replacement and support. They trusted that supplies would come. That reinforcements would arrive. That losses, while painful, would not end the fight. This trust allowed them to take risks without panic. German soldiers, particularly by the later years of the war, fought knowing that replacements were scarce. Every loss mattered deeply. Every retreat felt permanent. American soldiers, by contrast, fought with the belief that the system behind them was vast and dependable. This difference in mindset would shape every encounter that followed. In early stages, German officers mistook American confidence for arrogance. They believed it would vanish once blood was spilled. They believed reality would assert itself. Reality did, but not in the way they expected. American soldiers did not fight with the polished efficiency of the Wehrmacht. They fought messily at first. Mistakes were common. Coordination sometimes failed. But they compensated with persistence. They returned to the fight after losses. They attacked again after setbacks. They learned faster than anticipated. For the German army, this was not how wars were supposed to work. Traditionally, defeat taught caution. It slowed advances. It bred hesitation. But American forces treated defeat as temporary. A problem to be solved, not a verdict. This mindset began to unsettle German field commanders. It challenged their understanding of how morale functioned. It suggested that American strength did not lie in perfection, but in resilience. The Wehrmacht had trained to defeat armies that relied on rigid systems. Once disrupted, those systems collapsed. American forces, however, seemed comfortable operating amid disruption. Command structures bent rather than broke. At this stage of the war, fear had not yet taken hold. But doubt had. German officers began to realize that the American soldier could not be measured by European standards alone. He did not behave as expected. He did not react as predicted. And most importantly, he did not stop fighting simply because circumstances grew unfavorable. The early assumptions, that American troops were soft, dependent, and fragile, would soon be tested in battle. And as those tests unfolded, the Wehrmacht would be forced to confront a new reality. They had misjudged their enemy. And the price of that misjudgment would be paid on the battlefield. North Africa was never intended to be the stage where legends were made. To the German High Command, it was a secondary theater, a distant front where experienced units could delay Allied plans while the real war was decided elsewhere. To American commanders, however, it would become something far more important: a proving ground. For the first time, large formations of American soldiers would face the Wehrmacht directly. The expectations on both sides could not have been more different. German forces in North Africa were seasoned. Many had fought across Europe. They had maneuvered against British units, clashed with armor in open desert, and learned how to exploit speed and confusion. Officers like Erwin Rommel understood how to turn terrain, timing, and psychological pressure into decisive advantages. American troops, by contrast, arrived with limited combat experience. Many soldiers had trained intensively, but training was no substitute for fire. They were confident in their equipment, their numbers, and their cause, but confidence had yet to be tested by defeat. The first major clash would be brutal. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass, American forces encountered the Wehrmacht under conditions that favored German doctrine perfectly. The terrain was broken and restrictive. Communication between units was fragile. Leadership was inexperienced. German panzer units struck with precision, exploiting hesitation and gaps in American lines. The result was chaotic. American units were pushed back. Some positions collapsed under pressure. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery failed at critical moments. German attacks were swift and decisive, creating the impression that American forces were exactly what German intelligence had predicted: brave, but unprepared. German officers watching the engagement believed the case was closed. They wrote reports describing American troops as courageous but tactically naive. Soldiers who advanced willingly, but without cohesion. Units that relied too heavily on orders from above, freezing when communication broke down. It was, to them, the expected result of an inexperienced army facing professionals. But the battle at Kasserine Pass did not end the story. It began it. What followed was something the Wehrmacht had rarely witnessed in its enemies. The American army did not deny its failure. It did not hide it. It did not excuse it. Instead, it dissected it with ruthless honesty. Commanders who failed were removed quickly. There were no ceremonial protections for rank. If leadership proved ineffective under fire, it was replaced. New officers were promoted based on competence rather than seniority. This speed shocked even Allied observers. American training programs were revised while the campaign was still ongoing. Tactical manuals were rewritten based on lessons learned directly from combat. German methods of combined arms warfare were studied intensely, not with resentment, but with focus. American officers learned how German units coordinated armor, infantry, and artillery. They learned how German commanders exploited hesitation. They learned the importance of momentum and initiative. Most importantly, American soldiers were allowed, even encouraged, to learn. Mistakes were not treated as moral failures. They were treated as information. This approach was alien to the Wehrmacht. German doctrine valued precision and execution. Failure was often seen as a breakdown of discipline. The American approach treated failure as a temporary state, something that could be corrected quickly. Within weeks, the same American units returned to the battlefield transformed. Their artillery coordination improved dramatically. Fire support became faster, more accurate, and better integrated with infantry movements. American gunners began to respond to threats with speed that surprised German units accustomed to slower Allied reactions. Infantry units learned to move with purpose under fire. They learned to spread out, to avoid predictable patterns, to advance by fire and movement rather than massed rushes. Communication between small units improved as non-commissioned officers assumed greater responsibility. American armor, once vulnerable, became more cautious and effective. Tanks no longer advanced blindly into kill zones. They coordinated with infantry, using mutual support rather than brute force alone. German veterans noticed the difference immediately. Reports from the field began to change tone. American soldiers were no longer described as merely enthusiastic. They were described as adaptable, persistent, increasingly coordinated. Units that had been pushed aside at Kasserine were now holding ground and counterattacking with confidence. What unsettled German commanders most was the speed of this transformation. European armies historically took years to adapt doctrine. Changes were debated, formalized, and slowly implemented. The American army appeared to compress this process into months, sometimes weeks. This adaptability created uncertainty. German officers could no longer rely on past observations. The enemy they faced in March was not the enemy they had faced in February. Tactics that had worked once now failed. Ambushes were anticipated. Maneuvers were countered. For the first time, German field commanders began to ask a dangerous question. What if this army keeps learning? American soldiers themselves felt the change. Confidence replaced confusion. They had faced defeat and survived it. They had learned that German forces were formidable, but not invincible. This realization mattered deeply. Psychologically, Kasserine Pass became a turning point. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, not by victory, but by survival. American troops understood now what war demanded. They had been tested, and while they had stumbled, they had not collapsed. This knowledge hardened them. German forces, meanwhile, began to realize that early victories had not broken the enemy. They had merely alerted him. In subsequent engagements across Tunisia, American units fought with increasing discipline. They coordinated with British forces more effectively. They applied pressure continuously, forcing German units to respond rather than dictate the tempo. The desert, once a stage for German maneuver warfare, became increasingly contested. American logistics ensured steady supplies. Reinforcements arrived consistently. Where German units had to conserve strength, American units could maintain pressure. This imbalance mattered. German soldiers began to sense that time was no longer on their side. Every engagement, even a successful one, drained resources that could not easily be replaced. American losses, while painful, were absorbed by a system designed for endurance. The North African campaign did not end with a single dramatic collapse. It ended gradually, as German resistance became untenable. But by the time Axis forces surrendered in Tunisia, something irreversible had occurred. The Wehrmacht had learned its first real lesson about American soldiers. They were not fragile. They did not retreat permanently after defeat. They returned. More disciplined. More coordinated. More determined. The American army that emerged from North Africa was no longer an unknown quantity. It was an army that had faced failure and grown stronger because of it. For the Wehrmacht, this realization was deeply troubling. Because it suggested that every future battle would not weaken the Americans, but sharpen them. And worse still, it suggested that the longer the war continued, the more dangerous this enemy would become. North Africa was not the moment the Wehrmacht learned to fear American soldiers. But it was the moment they began to understand them. By the summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht knew an invasion of Western Europe was coming. It was no secret. What remained uncertain was where and how decisively it would strike. German commanders debated beaches, tides, and deception plans, but few questioned one assumption that had taken root since North Africa: American soldiers were improving, but they could still be broken if hit hard enough at the start. Normandy was supposed to be that moment. The Atlantic Wall was not merely concrete and steel. It was confidence made physical. Machine gun nests, artillery positions, minefields, and obstacles designed to channel attackers into killing zones. German doctrine assumed that a determined defense at the shoreline would shatter any assault before it could organize. The expectation was simple. Landings would be chaotic. Command structures would collapse. Casualties would overwhelm inexperienced troops. If pressure was applied early and relentlessly, American units would lose cohesion and retreat into the sea. On the morning of June 6, 1944, that theory met reality. As landing craft approached the beaches, German defenders opened fire. The sea churned with explosions. Men were cut down before reaching shore. Equipment sank. Officers were killed within minutes. Plans unraveled almost immediately. On Omaha Beach, conditions were catastrophic. Yet something unexpected happened. The Americans did not flee. Pinned down by machine gun fire, scattered by artillery, and stripped of command structures, American soldiers began to reorganize instinctively. Small groups formed wherever men found cover. Rank mattered less than action. Whoever was capable took charge. This behavior shocked German defenders. The Wehrmacht was trained to break armies by destroying leadership and communication. Once officers fell and plans collapsed, resistance was expected to fade. But American resistance did not depend entirely on centralized control. Sergeants led assaults without orders. Privates followed men they trusted rather than insignia. Soldiers crawled forward not because doctrine demanded it, but because survival required movement. German machine gunners later recalled their confusion. Waves did not come as expected. Instead, Americans advanced in fragments. When one group was pinned, another appeared elsewhere. When a position seemed secure, it was suddenly attacked from an unexpected angle. The beach did not become a single decisive killing ground. It became dozens of small, violent struggles unfolding simultaneously. This decentralized aggression undermined the very logic of the German defense. By mid-morning, gaps began to appear. Bluffs once thought impregnable were breached. American soldiers reached positions that German commanders had believed unreachable under fire. The price was high. Casualties were severe. But the advance continued. For the first time, German officers witnessed American troops absorbing extreme losses without collapse. This was not reckless courage. It was controlled persistence. Men advanced, regrouped, and advanced again. Once inland, the fighting did not become easier. Normandy's countryside was dominated by hedgerows, dense earthen embankments topped with thick vegetation. These natural fortifications restricted movement, limited visibility, and favored defenders who knew how to exploit them. German infantry had trained extensively in this terrain. They established interlocking fields of fire, concealed positions, and ambush points. The expectation was that American momentum would stall once the initial shock of the landings wore off. It did not. American units moved cautiously at first, suffering losses as they learned the deadly realities of the bocage. But once again, they adapted. Small unit tactics evolved rapidly. Infantry learned to clear hedgerows systematically rather than rush them. Tanks were modified in the field with improvised steel prongs designed to cut through embankments instead of climbing over them and exposing vulnerable underbellies. Artillery coordination improved dramatically. American gunners responded to requests for fire with speed and accuracy that surprised German units accustomed to slower Allied responses. Positions that resisted infantry attacks were isolated and destroyed methodically. German soldiers noticed a pattern. American attacks were not always elegant. They were not always perfectly executed. But they were relentless. If a German unit repelled an assault in the morning, it faced another in the afternoon. If it survived the afternoon, it was shelled at night. Pressure never ceased long enough to allow full recovery. This continuous pressure wore down even experienced German troops. Veterans later described the psychological strain of facing an enemy who did not pause. American units rotated fresh troops forward while exhausted units pulled back. Supplies flowed steadily. Ammunition shortages were rare. German units, by contrast, increasingly fought with dwindling resources. Reinforcements were scarce. Every loss mattered. Every retreat reduced defensive depth. The imbalance became apparent. American soldiers also displayed a confidence that unsettled their opponents. They trusted that support was always available. That artillery would answer. That air power would arrive. This trust allowed them to press forward even when conditions were unfavorable. German officers began to revise their assessments. Reports described American soldiers as disciplined, aggressive, and capable of independent action. The earlier stereotypes of softness faded rapidly. What replaced them was a recognition that the Americans possessed a unique blend of structure and flexibility. They followed plans, until plans failed. Then they improvised. This adaptability made American units difficult to predict. German defenses, designed to exploit predictable assaults, found themselves outmaneuvered by enemies who changed methods constantly. As the battle for Normandy dragged on, the Wehrmacht began to lose not only ground, but confidence. The realization set in that the Americans were not merely advancing because of numbers. They were advancing because they learned faster than they could be stopped. Every engagement taught American units something new. Every mistake became a lesson. The battlefield itself became a training ground. By late July, when Allied forces finally broke out of Normandy, German resistance was exhausted. Units that had expected to hold firm for months were shattered. Commanders who had believed American momentum could be halted now faced a grim truth. The enemy they faced in Normandy was not the same enemy they had dismissed 2 years earlier. The landings had not broken American morale. The hedgerows had not slowed their learning. The casualties had not stopped their advance. For the Wehrmacht, Normandy marked a turning point. It was the moment American soldiers ceased to be underestimated. It was the moment respect hardened into something closer to fear. Because the Germans now understood something critical. If American troops could fight their way off the beaches of Normandy, under the worst conditions imaginable, then no defensive line could be considered truly secure. And the war, from that moment on, would only move in one direction. After the landings in Normandy, the war did not explode forward as many Allied planners had hoped. Instead, it slowed into something far more brutal and exhausting. The beaches were behind them, but the real test of endurance had only begun. The American advance now faced an enemy that was wounded, but still highly dangerous, and terrain that favored defense in every possible way. The hedgerows of Normandy, known as the bocage, were unlike anything most American soldiers had trained to fight in. Ancient earthen embankments, some centuries old, rose chest-high or higher, topped with thick vegetation and tangled roots. Fields were small and enclosed, visibility limited to a few yards. Every hedgerow was a potential fortress. Every gap was a potential death trap. For German infantry, this terrain was ideal. German units dug in with precision. Machine guns were positioned to cover narrow lanes. Mortars were pre-registered on likely approaches. Infantry waited in concealed positions, allowing American units to move forward before unleashing sudden, devastating fire. Tanks could not maneuver freely. Artillery observers were difficult to place. German doctrine emphasized exactly this kind of defensive fighting. Delay the enemy. Bleed him. Force him to advance cautiously and lose momentum. The expectation was that American units, still relatively new to sustained ground combat in Europe, would become bogged down, frustrated, and demoralized. At first, that expectation seemed reasonable. American patrols walked into ambushes. Squads were pinned down without understanding where the fire was coming from. Tanks exposed themselves when attempting to climb hedgerows, only to be knocked out at close range. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Losses mounted. But once again, the American response was not withdrawal, it was adaptation. Instead of repeating failed assaults, American units began to analyze the terrain with methodical focus. Officers and non-commissioned officers studied German defensive patterns. They observed how machine guns covered likely approaches. They noted where mortars were placed. They learned where German infantry preferred to hide. This learning did not occur in classrooms. It occurred under fire. Small unit tactics evolved rapidly. Infantry stopped advancing in large formations. Squads learned to move independently, using fire and maneuver to probe defenses. One element pinned the enemy while another flanked. Communication between squads improved as leaders learned to anticipate rather than react. American artillery became a decisive factor. Requests for fire were processed quickly. Forward observers operated closer to the front lines, adjusting fire with precision. Hedgerows that resisted infantry assaults were isolated and systematically destroyed. The most famous adaptation was born not from doctrine, but from necessity. American tank crews, frustrated by the inability to push through hedgerows without exposing themselves, began welding steel prongs to the fronts of their tanks. These crude devices allowed tanks to punch through embankments rather than climb over them, reducing vulnerability and restoring mobility. This innovation spread rapidly across units. German soldiers were stunned by how quickly the Americans solved the problem. Terrain that had offered security suddenly became uncertain. Positions that had felt protected were breached without warning. What unsettled German infantry most was not any single tactic, but the rhythm of American operations. There was no pause. If an attack failed in the morning, another followed in the afternoon. If a position held through the day, it was shelled at night. Fresh units rotated forward. Supplies arrived steadily. Ammunition was plentiful. German units, by contrast, fought with growing scarcity. Reinforcements were limited. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Tanks could not be replaced easily. Every casualty reduced combat power permanently. The pressure was constant. German veterans later described the psychological toll of facing American units in the bocage. Even when attacks were repelled, there was no sense of relief. The Americans would return. Sometimes from the same direction. Sometimes from another. Always with renewed force. This persistence eroded morale. American soldiers also demonstrated a discipline that contradicted earlier German assumptions. Attacks were not chaotic. They were deliberate. Units advanced cautiously, coordinating movement and fire. Losses were accepted, but not wasted. German defenders noticed that American units did not rush blindly into machine gun fire. They probed. They tested. They adjusted. And once they found a weakness, they exploited it relentlessly. The Hedgerow War became a contest of endurance rather than brilliance. German doctrine prized decisive engagements. The Americans, instead, forced a grinding struggle that favored their strengths. Logistics played a crucial role. American supply lines functioned with remarkable reliability. Food, ammunition, fuel, and medical support flowed forward continuously. Wounded soldiers were evacuated quickly. Fresh troops replaced exhausted ones. German units had no such luxury. As Allied air power increased, supply routes were disrupted. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Units often fought without knowing when, or if, resupply would arrive. This imbalance deepened the sense of inevitability. German commanders began to realize that holding ground in the bocage was costing more than it could save. Each delay inflicted losses, but the Americans absorbed them. German losses, however, accumulated without replacement. American soldiers, for their part, grew increasingly confident. They understood now that German defenses, no matter how skillfully constructed, could be overcome with patience and coordination. This confidence was not reckless. It was earned. They had learned to fight the Wehrmacht on its own terms, and then change the terms entirely. By July 1944, German resistance in Normandy was cracking. Units that had expected to delay the Allies for months were exhausted. Commanders reported that American pressure was unrelenting, methodical, and psychologically draining. The breakout that followed was not sudden. It was the result of weeks of sustained pressure. When German lines finally gave way, it was not because they had been outmaneuvered in a single brilliant stroke, but because they had been worn down. For the Wehrmacht, the Hedgerow War delivered a painful lesson. American soldiers could fight in the most restrictive terrain imaginable. They could adapt faster than anticipated. And once engaged, they would not stop applying pressure until resistance collapsed. The Hedgerows, once a symbol of German defensive strength, became a symbol of something else entirely. They became the place where the Wehrmacht learned that American persistence was as dangerous as American firepower. And as the Americans broke out of Normandy and began racing across France, German soldiers understood that the war had entered a new phase. One in which holding the line was no longer enough. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had taken on a strange and dangerous rhythm. The Wehrmacht was retreating on multiple fronts, yet it was far from defeated. German forces still possessed experienced units, capable commanders, and the will to strike back if given the opportunity. What they lacked was time. The German High Command believed that one decisive blow could still change the course of the war. That blow would come in the Ardennes. The plan was bold, desperate, and rooted in a familiar belief that American forces, stretched thin and inexperienced in prolonged winter combat, could be broken by shock, surprise, and isolation. If American units could be surrounded, cut off from supply, and subjected to sustained pressure, their morale would collapse. The Americans, the Germans believed, would surrender. Bastogne became the center of that belief. Located at a critical road junction, the town was vital for any advance westward. When German forces launched their offensive in December 1944, they moved swiftly, exploiting poor weather and thinly held American lines. Units were pushed back. Confusion spread. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles and refugees. In the chaos, American airborne troops were rushed into Bastogne with little preparation. They arrived without sufficient winter clothing. Supplies were limited. Artillery ammunition was scarce. Medical facilities were overwhelmed almost immediately. Within days, German forces had encircled the town. From a purely tactical perspective, Bastogne appeared doomed. The Americans inside were surrounded. German artillery pounded their positions. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow covered the ground. Foxholes became frozen graves. Frostbite claimed almost as many casualties as enemy fire. German commanders believed the situation was clear. Surrounded units, deprived of supplies, facing superior numbers, were expected to break. Doctrine suggested that resistance would weaken as hunger, cold, and exhaustion took their toll. Surrender, in German thinking, was not dishonorable under such circumstances. It was logical. A surrender demand was drafted and delivered under a white flag. The response came back short, informal, and utterly unexpected. Nuts. At first, the German officers did not understand the message. It had to be explained. When its meaning became clear, disbelief followed. This was not the response of a defeated force. It was not even the response of a desperate one. It was the response of an enemy who had no intention of surrendering. For the Wehrmacht, this moment marked a shift from frustration to unease. The Americans were not behaving according to expectation. They were not negotiating. They were not signaling weakness. They were preparing to fight. Inside Bastogne, conditions were brutal. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Wounded soldiers lay in makeshift aid stations without adequate medical equipment. Artillery units rationed shells carefully, firing only when targets were confirmed. Infantry rotated positions constantly to prevent freezing in place. Yet discipline held. American soldiers dug deeper. They reinforced defensive positions. They maintained communication under fire. Small unit leaders took responsibility for sectors, adapting to changing threats without waiting for orders that might never arrive. German attacks came repeatedly. Infantry assaults probed the perimeter. Armor attempted to break through weak points. Artillery barrages preceded advances meant to shatter morale. Each time, the Americans responded with controlled resistance. German soldiers later recalled the shock of encountering organized defense from men who were cold, hungry, and exhausted. Instead of weakening, American fire seemed focused and deliberate. Defensive lines bent, but did not collapse. What puzzled German commanders most was the absence of panic. There were no mass surrenders. No disorderly withdrawals. No breakdown of cohesion. American troops understood the reality of their situation. They knew relief was uncertain. They knew that survival depended on holding out. And they trusted, not blindly, but with conviction, that support would come. That trust mattered. When weather conditions finally improved, American air power returned. Supplies were dropped into the besieged town. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies fell from the sky. Morale surged. German forces now faced an enemy that had endured the worst conditions imaginable, and grown stronger because of it. The attacks intensified, but results did not change. Each failed assault cost the Wehrmacht men and material it could no longer afford to lose. Tanks destroyed at Bastogne could not be replaced easily. Infantry losses were permanent. The offensive, meant to break American morale, was bleeding German strength instead. As days passed, German commanders realized the truth. Bastogne was not collapsing. It was holding. When American relief forces finally broke through, the German offensive had lost its momentum. The window of opportunity closed. The gamble had failed. For the Wehrmacht, Bastogne became a symbol, not of American firepower, but of American character. German veterans later spoke of Bastogne with reluctant respect. They described an enemy that refused to behave as expected. An enemy that did not surrender when surrounded. An enemy that endured cold, hunger, and isolation without losing discipline. The surrender demand and its reply became legendary, but the true lesson ran deeper. American soldiers did not fight because victory was guaranteed. They fought because surrender was not considered an option. This mindset unnerved German commanders more than any weapon. Bastogne demonstrated that American units could be isolated, and still function. They could be cut off, and still fight effectively. They could be pushed to the edge of human endurance, and still hold the line. For the Wehrmacht, this realization was decisive. The belief that American morale could be shattered by encirclement was proven false. The belief that American soldiers would surrender when logic demanded it was shattered completely. From that moment on, German commanders understood that American troops could not be defeated simply by placing them in impossible situations. They would endure them. And Bastogne, frozen and battered, became one of the clearest examples of why the Wehrmacht had learned to fear American soldiers. By early 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered its final phase. The Wehrmacht was no longer planning grand offensives. It was fighting for survival, for delay, for the hope that something, anything, might change the outcome. American forces, meanwhile, were no longer proving themselves. They were executing. The crossing into Germany itself carried enormous symbolic weight. For years, German soldiers had fought on foreign soil, advancing, occupying, and enforcing their will across Europe. Now, the war had come home. Towns, cities, and countryside that had once been distant abstractions became battlefields. German commanders hoped that defending the homeland would inspire renewed resistance. They believed that fighting on German soil would stiffen resolve, that desperation might compensate for material shortages. In some cases, resistance did intensify. Units fought stubbornly for villages, bridges, and river crossings. But something fundamental had changed. American forces entering Germany were not the same troops that had landed in North Africa or even Normandy. They were veterans. Units had been hardened by months of continuous combat. Soldiers understood the rhythms of battle. Leaders at every level knew how to coordinate fire, movement, and logistics with practiced confidence. This experience showed immediately. American advances were deliberate and systematic. Units moved with purpose, securing flanks, maintaining supply lines, and rotating exhausted troops without losing momentum. When resistance was encountered, it was addressed methodically, isolated, suppressed, and overcome. German soldiers noticed the difference. Gone were the assumptions of amateurism. Gone were expectations of disorder. Instead, they faced an enemy that advanced with quiet certainty. American units did not rush. They did not gamble. They applied overwhelming force precisely where needed. Artillery played a decisive role. American artillery coordination had reached a level that impressed even seasoned German veterans. Requests for fire were answered quickly. Barrages were accurate and sustained. Defensive positions that might have held against infantry alone were shattered before assaults even began. German units increasingly found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to anticipate their moves. Defensive lines were outflanked. Ambushes were neutralized. Withdrawal routes were cut off by rapid American maneuver. Air power compounded the problem. With the Luftwaffe largely neutralized, American aircraft operated with near impunity. Supply columns, troop movements, and defensive positions were observed and attacked relentlessly. German units were forced to move at night, reducing coordination and increasing exhaustion. The psychological impact was severe. German soldiers understood that they were being watched constantly. Any concentration of force risked immediate destruction. The freedom of movement that had once defined German operations was gone. American soldiers, by contrast, advanced with confidence in their support. They trusted that artillery and air power would answer calls for help. They trusted their logistics. They trusted their leadership. This trust allowed them to maintain momentum even in difficult terrain. Urban combat presented new challenges. German cities offered dense, complex environments ideal for defense. Rubble provided cover. Streets were narrow. Civilians were present. German defenders hoped that urban fighting would slow the American advance and inflict heavy casualties. American units adapted once again. Cities were cleared block by block. Infantry coordinated closely with armor. Buildings were isolated before being assaulted. Resistance was crushed systematically rather than rushed. German soldiers observed that American forces did not seek dramatic victories. They sought control. Each block was secured before moving on. Each pocket of resistance was eliminated methodically. This approach minimized unnecessary losses while maintaining steady progress. Logistics continued to play a crucial role. American supply systems functioned with remarkable reliability even as units pushed deep into Germany. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical support remained available. Wounded soldiers were evacuated quickly. Fresh units rotated forward. German forces, meanwhile, struggled with shortages of every kind. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement troops were often poorly trained or hastily assembled. Veteran units were worn thin. The contrast was stark. German soldiers increasingly recognized that holding ground was futile. Even when resistance succeeded temporarily, it achieved little more than delay. American forces regrouped and advanced again, often with greater strength. This inevitability weighed heavily on morale. German veterans later recalled the sense of fighting an enemy that could not be exhausted. Losses inflicted did not slow the advance. Successful defenses did not change the outcome. The Americans simply adjusted and continued. For many German units, the war became a series of withdrawals rather than battles. Commanders focused on saving what remained of their forces rather than achieving victory. American discipline during this phase of the war also left an impression. Despite the intensity of combat, American units maintained order. Prisoners were processed efficiently. Civilians were handled with relative restraint compared to the brutalities seen earlier in the war. German soldiers noted that American forces fought the war methodically rather than vengefully. This professionalism reinforced the sense that the Americans were not improvising anymore. They were executing a system refined by experience. River crossings, once major obstacles, were conducted with confidence. Engineering units worked seamlessly with infantry and armor. Bridges were secured or constructed rapidly. German attempts to delay advances by destroying infrastructure were often neutralized quickly. Each success built momentum. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the remaining Wehrmacht units faced an unavoidable truth. The enemy they now faced was not only materially superior, but mentally unshakable. American soldiers advanced with the certainty that victory was only a matter of time. This certainty was not arrogance. It was earned. German commanders could no longer rely on surprise or shock. They could no longer count on American hesitation. Every encounter confirmed the same pattern: resistance would be met, absorbed, and overcome. By the spring of 1945, the fear was no longer theoretical. German soldiers understood that when American units appeared, the battle was already lost. The only question was how long it would take. The advance into Germany demonstrated the final evolution of the American army in Europe. From untested formations, they had become a force defined by discipline, coordination, and relentless momentum. For the Wehrmacht, this realization came too late. The war had entered its final chapter. And the enemy they once dismissed was now impossible to stop. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the silence that followed was unlike anything the continent had known in years. For the Wehrmacht, defeat was not only military, it was psychological. The enemy they had once dismissed, underestimated, and openly mocked had become the force that crushed them. In the aftermath, German officers, soldiers, and historians began asking difficult questions. How had it happened? How had an army with limited combat experience at the start of the war grown into such an overwhelming force in such a short time? The answer was not simple. But it was clear. The Wehrmacht did not fear American soldiers because of blind aggression or brute strength alone. They feared them because the Americans learned, fast, relentlessly, and without ego. Early in the war, German troops had found American units predictable and sometimes reckless. But instead of repeating mistakes, American forces studied them. Every failure became a lesson. Every defeat became data. This ability to adapt would become their greatest weapon. American command structures encouraged initiative. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were expected to think, to react, to adjust. When plans failed, and they often did, units did not freeze. They adapted. German forces, built around rigid doctrine and centralized control, struggled against this flexibility. As the war progressed, American units became increasingly difficult to predict. They did not rely on a single method of fighting. They used firepower when necessary. Maneuver when possible. Patience when required. Aggression when advantageous. And they did all of it with coordination. German veterans repeatedly noted that American assaults rarely felt chaotic. Even under intense pressure, American units maintained structure. Artillery supported infantry. Armor protected advances. Engineers removed obstacles. Medical teams evacuated wounded efficiently. This system worked, even when individual soldiers were afraid, exhausted, or wounded. Fear did not disappear. But discipline carried them forward. The Wehrmacht also learned to fear American logistics, a factor often overlooked by those who focus only on battlefield heroics. American supply lines delivered what was needed, when it was needed, across vast distances. Food arrived. Ammunition flowed. Fuel was available. Replacements came. German units, by contrast, increasingly fought without certainty. Supplies were delayed or non-existent. Wounded men stayed in the line. Vehicles ran dry. Morale suffered. The American system did not break under pressure. It absorbed pressure. And then there was the American soldier himself. Contrary to early German stereotypes, American troops proved resilient. They endured harsh weather, constant combat, and heavy casualties. They fought not for conquest, but for each other, for survival, and for the belief that the war had to end decisively. German soldiers encountered Americans who advanced even after setbacks, who returned after losses, who regrouped and attacked again. This persistence became terrifying. German veterans later described a sense of inevitability. No matter how well a defense was prepared, American forces would find a way through or around it. No matter how heavy the losses inflicted, the Americans returned. This was not recklessness. It was confidence backed by overwhelming coordination. By 1945, the Wehrmacht no longer spoke of American soldiers as amateurs. They spoke of them as professionals. Reports described American units as calm under fire. Methodical. Efficient. Relentless. Even German commanders who despised the enemy acknowledged their effectiveness. In many post-war accounts, German officers admitted that once American forces were fully engaged, defeat was only a matter of time. The question was never if they would break through, only when. This realization eroded resistance faster than any artillery barrage. Fear does not always come from brutality. Sometimes it comes from certainty. American forces represented certainty. They did not fight for dramatic victories. They fought to advance, secure, and continue. Every objective achieved became the foundation for the next. The Wehrmacht had once prided itself on speed, shock, and decisive action. By the end of the war, those qualities had been neutralized by an enemy who refused to panic, refused to collapse, and refused to stop. American soldiers did not need to be fearless. They needed to be dependable. And they were. The verdict, delivered by history and confirmed by those who faced them, was unavoidable. The Wehrmacht learned to fear American soldiers because they were no longer an experiment. They were no longer untested. They were a force forged in combat, refined through failure, and strengthened by coordination. They represented the modern battlefield, where logistics, intelligence, adaptability, and discipline mattered more than ideology or bravado. By the time Germany fell, the transformation was complete. The army once mocked had become the army that could not be stopped. And that is why, long after the war ended, German veterans remembered one truth above all others. When American soldiers arrived, the outcome was already decided.